Subramanian, you've said hyper-globalization is dead, but long live globalization. I have a counter point of view, and I'm going to ask you a very frank question. Are we calling this trend by all these names instead of shying away and just saying this is deglobalization? The world is seeing protectionist trends rise from whether it's US, UK, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, what explains that? What will the future of this new globalization be?
Yeah, see, I think we have to be a little bit careful here. First, between a lot of rhetoric that we've seen around the world and the actual actions taken, mercifully, there's still a big gap. If the actions catch up with the rhetoric, then we're in serious trouble. So let's wait and watch. Second, I think the word globalization is kind of a little bit misused and kind of, you need to parse it, right? In Australia, it's about immigration. I mean, Australia is not saying we're going to raise tariffs, et cetera, right? In Europe, for example, what we saw in Brexit were two things. One, again, against migration, and of course, in Europe and Germany as well, the refugee problem is big. And we saw this, people wanting to take control of their destinies. Neither the UK nor Europe is saying we're going to raise trade barriers or we're going to, slap on these things, etc. With the United States, things are a little bit in flux. I think there is, a lot of rhetoric which says, trade barriers might also go up. So I think we need to distinguish these different forms. For India, what matters is, we export a lot of services. We also export a lot of, goods like, textiles, clothing, pharmaceuticals, etc. We need to keep focused on, the products that we are exporting. And as long as those remain relatively unchallenged, I think we can negotiate that. The last point I would make is that if you look at the actual numbers over the last, say 25, 30 years, one way of measuring globalization is to look at trade to GDP at the global level. After about 80, 85, it sort of soared, and that's what I call the period of hyperglobalization. After the crisis, what happened was there was deglobalization, but that had to do not with protectionist action so much as, growth declined. I think value chains had exhausted their potential. So now we're seeing a kind of tapering off, and now suddenly again we're seeing a slight revival, so on. So I don't think we're going to see deglobalization massively. And as I said, the reason is that if you see why did this trade increase, it's because, the container got invented. We get more, fall in transportation costs, fall in information costs. No one can stop that, and not even, all the powers in the United States and Europe and China can stop that. So that technology is going to continue. And that's why I think hyper-globalization might be dead, but not globalization.
So I'm just going to take a quick follow-up with you on that. Are you here suggesting at one level that countries will not have a choice? I'm not going to perhaps use the word deglobalization then in today's context, but countries will no longer have a choice. We will see a different face of globalization going forward, because there are critics of what's happening around the world today who say that the developed world was all right with globalization till it suited them, and this is the hyper-globalization phase that we're talking about. But when the developing world is standing up there and you're considering a stake in that pie, that is when the problems are arising.
That's absolutely right. I think there is, what has happened is that now suddenly when China and India have been one of the biggest beneficiaries of globalization, and just when that's beginning to happen, we are seeing, kind of the rhetoric changing. As I said, let's wait and watch. If in fact we do get protectionist action, then you will be 100% right that, we will see a phase of deglobalization. But I don't expect that to happen. I think, just to give you why I feel a little bit confident, if you look at the value-added chain, you can't even identify, when you say made in India or made in China or made in the US, you can't figure out, there are 100 different parts coming from 100 different countries. So it's going to be very difficult to undo all that. And the other interesting thing is that, take FDI, for example, right? In the old days, we used to get all the FDI. Now we get FDI, we send out FDI. So it's become a much more two-way process. So undoing this is going to be politically very difficult, but we have to be watchful.
I'm going to come back to you about Make in India, because I think we've got to spend considerable time given the new context. But Mr. Chatterjee, do you believe given the new definition and the new face of globalization that we are seeing, one also needs to take into account investments or job creation more locally. Because once countries start looking inwardly, it's also going to hamper their own economies, right?
That is certainly true. And in the context of India, we have noticed a certain trend on FDI that's coming in. The large chunks of FDI have been coming into infrastructure. I mean, you've got names like the Canadian pension funds, Brookfield, etc., etc. Now remember, practically all of them are not coming into new greenfield ventures.
That's right.
They're coming into acquiring or taking over existing or almost complete brownfield ventures. And that, so there is a qualitative difference in FDI. There is FDI that comes in, which creates a new asset, creates jobs. And there is FDI that is partly solving the twin balance sheet problem by coming in and taking over existing assets. So while that's welcome, because it is bringing the much needed capital and loosening up the balance sheets of others, but it is not leading to creation of jobs.
China, at the peak of its growth, used to get 100 billion FDI. We get 65, 70 today. So we're like, in the old days it used to be 10 to 1 ratio. Now India gets 65. So we're approaching those really astronomical numbers, which is very good news. However, I think we have to be a bit careful. If you look at the FDI, a lot of it comes from Singapore and Mauritius, right? Now, I don't know how much of it. So one distinction that Vinayak is making is between greenfield and brownfield. The other distinction given this is, I'm not sure how much is going into manufacturing, plant and machinery, and how much is going into financial services, startups, etc., etc. And so we need to monitor this carefully. So I think the impact on Make in India and in terms of jobs will, of course, depend a lot on where this FDI comes. If it comes in infrastructure, manufacturing, I think the impact will be much greater.
But Dr. Subramanian, you know, you're almost cueing me to my next question, because if we look at the scenario that the world is witnessing, which is rise of these seemingly trade barriers, rise of protectionist tendencies, if not barriers coming up, so tariffs going higher. Where does Make in India stand amidst all of that? Because Make in India, in principle, is a very export-led driven sort of an ideology. Does the world have room or space for that sort of an initiative? And should India instead give a fillip to its services and not be obsessed with manufacturing? And I will take up the industry part of manufacturing and Make in India with Mr. Chatterjee. But let me just ask you, Make in India, does it hold water? Does it hold ground at all today?
Yeah. See, remember, the way I've always interpreted Make in India is to make the Indian economy globally competitive. I mean, that's what I think broadly is the message and the intent behind Make in India. So if you're going to become globally competitive, that means, you know, you need to export a lot. And that also means that, you know, we produce more domestically what was being imported previously. So both components are important. Now, it's true that if, for example, you know, other people start imposing trade barriers, it is going to be difficult for us to realize Make in India. My worry is, I mean, the worry is, a second worry I have is that if others start doing this, there will be groups within India which say, and I hope, you know, you are not amongst those groups, although I'm not sure, I'm never sure of all of you people here, by the way.
But suspicious about Indian industry.
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical about all of you here. The thing is that, because I feel that people here might say, oh look, others are raising barriers, we should also raise barriers. And that's the kind of dynamic that I worry about. So I think both we need to champion openness outside and we need to be more open ourselves.
But if those barriers rise, do we still insist upon making in India?
Yeah, see, remember that you have to be globally competitive. You can't say, oh, the markets are being closed there, therefore I will, you know, start making my industry less competitive. You have to be competitive. That's regardless of the international environment.
Contrary to what Dr. Subramanian is saying, Make in India in the common parlance, and we can do a dipstick check, seemingly is about manufacturing, you know, but I think the age of those big mega factories is over. There's a lot of robots on the shop floor. There is artificial intelligence that people are using. Given that context, do we still obsess over manufacturing and Make in India, especially at a time when perhaps the export pie, the global trade, will shrink?
You know, the truth is that large portions of Indian industry, be it manufacturing or be it services, are today islands of excellence. unfortunately floating in a sea of morass. Because the environment in which we are being asked to be competitive, like Dr. Subramanian is urging us to be globally competitive. If you visit most of the factories that are at a reasonable level today, or IT companies, or biotech companies, or services, actually in the micro world of the firm, Indians are pretty globally competitive. The reason we are not globally competitive at the macro level is because we are hamstrung by the environment we are working in, and we mentioned some of them. High capital cost, non-facilitative government policies, electricity distribution, labor laws, the whole chakkar of now trying to remove all those barriers of Inspector Raj called ease of business. So the issue is, the fundamental question for Dr. Subramanian to address as a clinical economist, and I challenge him to do that, is this. If I were to distribute 100 points and ask him, how much of this is because of Indian industry being lethargic, laid back, uncaring, protectionist, and we are just not globally competitive? And how much of it is because the operating environment in the last 60 years of our economy, our government, our bureaucracy, and the systems within which we operate do not allow us to be globally competitive?
Okay. So let's have you take the challenge, and then I will. So that's his ilk laughing, just in case.
I mean, it's all the same tribe, my friends. I don't, I don't take it very seriously. But okay, I want to make 2 or 3 points, right? One is that, look, all the things that Vinayak enumerated, I think he's absolutely right. I mean, after all, I mean, we said it in the survey very eloquently. I mean, for example, I feel like Vinayak, we need to address the twin balance sheet problem. I feel very strongly, like Vinayak, that, we need one market in power in India. I think that by imposing restrictions on sale of power within India, we make huge swathes of Indian industry, even, labor-intensive sectors, are highly uncompetitive. So I think all these points are, I think, very well taken, and I think it's up to industry and, of course, up to government to address these problems. And I think no one, disputes that. But note that Mr. Vinayak Chatterjee, super efficient, super successful, super thoughtful, has fallen victim to exactly what I said. When he raises all the macro issues, he does not touch upon the exchange rate. It's as if, it's someone else deciding that. I mean, it is a very important macro factor determining competitiveness. I get texts from, our clothing industry and so on saying, sir, it's becoming, but yet all of you are so silent. So I plead guilty to what, we may not have done. But I think you should do the same and reciprocate the confession, my friend.
I'm quite loving this session. I wonder if you are too. But I'm going to have you take both those points. First, why is Indian industry so eloquently silent on exchange rates? He's right. It's as if it's somebody else's problems. And the other fear, that if trade barriers around the world go up, will Indian industry also lobby, urge, and make noises about our own trade barriers going up? And that is perhaps going to be the end of globalization then.
Listen, Indian industry is a nice homogeneous word, but within that homogeneity is a lot of heterogeneity. I mean, within CII and most of here are CII loyalists, members, we have the Steel Users Association and we have the Steel Producers Association. Mr. Narendran of Tata Steel is sitting right in front of me. So please remember that there are exporters and there are importers for whom the implications of the exchange rate are different. An exporter would gloat with getting more rupees for the dollar, whereas an importer would not. And India, historically, our mindsets, India has been a hugely import-driven economy for large portions of its independent life. And even assuming that we are now global and export out, there is a fundamental dichotomy within Indian industry as to ask Narendran, ask Chandrajit Banerjee how much hair is split between what should be the right minimum import price for steel and whether Indian steel industry is to be protected or not. We've got heterogeneity as it should be within our membership. Within our membership, we have people who want a stronger rupee and we have people within the membership who want a weaker rupee. So
where does one strike the balance?
So the question really is, I'm going to pass the buck to the incoming president of CII. So here we have Shobana sitting right in front, listening
I'm going to get her as the first question.
In her first National Council meeting, she will resolve the issue and she will answer Dr. Subramanian as to why Indian industry is not so good.
It's always, and just for the benefit of everybody sitting here, it always takes a woman to resolve the most controversial subject. So big round of applause there for all the women in this room. But yeah,
I'm extremely disappointed by Vinayak's passing the buck. I think no, but more seriously, I think that you know, if you want a competitive industry, I mean, both which is exporting a lot and which is actually, you know, more successful against import competition as well, I think we have to have a competitive exchange rate. I mean, all the history of the East European, East Asian countries is unambiguous on this point. Unambiguous. That especially if you want labor skill, you know, manufacturing to grow, I mean, you need a competitive exchange rate. It's just history is unmistakable.
Dr. Subramanian, it's time to make some honest confessions to this room here. It's all right to point fingers, and rightly so. You've been in New Delhi for a while now. Will you disagree that the current or whatever the forex rates or the exchange rates are still very much a mark of national pride? A stronger rupee always seems to connote with national pride. Have mindsets changed on that, and do you struggle with it? And I'm not just talking about industry, I'm talking about the political class as well.
No, as I said very clearly, I think that it is somewhat, you know, muddled thinking to equate that. I think that we have to look at the exchange rates from the point of view of what's good for our economy and what's good for our international competitiveness. To equate, you know, a strong rupee with strength, national strength, or, you know, some kind of economic strength is profoundly misguided. Because you look at China, for example, you know, they've been very, very clear on, you know, how do you get the export machine going. You look at now all the battles that are taking place internationally. You know, during, you know, when Raghu complained about, for example, you know, during the period of QE, all this capital coming in, and part of the complaint was that all this capital comes in and makes a rupee too strong and uncompetitive. So I think the experience is very clear. I think, therefore, I do think it's a bit misguided to associate a strong currency with strength. I think it's misguided.
But our central bank and our policymakers continue to do that, don't they?
No, this is not a. I think this is not a you know, attack at any one institution or this. Look, it's about all of us need to debate this as a society. I mean, you know, there'll be economists on one side, and from what I hear from Vinayak, you know, it's a house divided within CII. But I think unless, you see, all, you know, my view on this is that many of the things that we, for example, that Vinayak complains about that we haven't done, I mean, I just do not want to point fingers at any one government or any one thing, because it's a history of these things, not happened for, you know, many, many years. And that partly reflects the fact that, or a lot, that we as a society do not have a kind of common understanding about, or common consensus on many of these issues. That's why it becomes, you know, difficult to do it.
The world as a global workplace, has that come to an end, or at least limited?
So you know, I think I both agree and disagree with Vinayak and the question, in relation to the question that you asked. I mean, clearly, no matter what happens, what you control is what you can do domestically. But of course, you can also a little bit influence what happens externally through our negotiations and everything. But predominantly, Vinayak is right. But I think in thinking about this problem, I don't think that the whole job challenge is unrelated to globalization. Let me say this in the 2 or 3 dimensions to this. First, if our exports can grow rapidly, our economy grows rapidly, that leads to job creation. So globalization in some cases, in some ways, is very important to our job growth in that sense. Second, I think that, you know, in the West, the big debate has been, is it globalization or is it technology that's destroyed jobs and so on? I think that while this has been a debate that's been aired in the West, I think increasingly we're also seeing signs of this. That, you know, for example, to me, it is a scary thought that a robot can start cutting soft cloth and basically displace, you know, a lot of labor-intensive stuff. Yeah, they'll be, exactly, robots will be on the panel. So I think that just to understand the nature and the magnitude of the problem, I think globalization and technology are going to be very integral to, in fact, how we think about the problem. What we need to do will also be determined by, our perspective on what happens. And I think that we need to keep that in mind.
So do you believe the H-1B visa issue that's coming out of the US is being unnecessarily blown out of proportion? Because Mr. Narendran will tell you that his friends at TCS are unduly worried about it.
See, on this I'm very clear. First, let's wait to see what happens. As I've said recently, that if we start getting restrictions, serious restrictions on the H-1B, I think it is going to be a problem for India. Because, people, I think, and this is where maybe just, give me 1 second to explain. I think people think of, the benefits of an H-1B visa as just Indians going, high-skilled people getting jobs, getting foreign exchange, so on. It is much bigger than that, much bigger than that. I mean, when Indians go abroad, work abroad, there is a kind of, circulatory advantage to this. They go abroad, they learn, they build a reputation and a brand for India abroad. They come back with their human capital skills and contribute to Indian industry. So this flow of human capital that happens from this, and remember, our IT services took off because India had a brand reputation for doing good stuff, which was established by this H-1B thing. So I think it's much more than just, we're sending a few 100,000 engineers. It's much bigger than that. That's why I think it's very important that, there not be restrictions on our exports of services.
Mr. Chatterjee, you say globalization baad mein dekhenge, let's do stuff at home. Let me just turn the question on its head. What do Indian companies do when they are perhaps going to be forced, at least in the foreseeable future, to look at the market within India? The per capita GDP is very low. We're not a market like a US or China. Consumption is low. Where will that consumption come from?
Very good question.
Thank you very much.
For a change, I will agree with Arvind, because he's been...
Thank God, I've got the two to agree finally.
And with you.
Because he's been pretty fanatical about saying, and I've read some of his pieces over the years, which says that all countries that have done well domestically have necessarily also done well on exports. So we can't be facetious about globalization. It's not that I'm only focusing on the domestic market. I think we have to worry about the potential for export, because if there is insufficient demand, consumption demand or investment demand domestically, we necessarily have to go outside. It's not just IT services, it's project exports, it's garments, it's engineering services, it's pharmaceuticals, it's everything. We have to go abroad. There's just no question. So in a sense, there is really no argument. We have to be concerned about globalization, but at the same time, remember all the FDI that we are so proud about, and I'm happy about your number of 72 billion and how we are inching closer to the Chinese. They are coming to India to exploit our domestic market. So, on the one hand, we are very proud of the fact that the 72 billion is coming to India, not necessarily because they love us, because they see it as one of the world's largest remaining consumption markets for goods and services. So, therefore, for us not to take that seriously and look at globalization seems a little odd also.
Should you be taxing the Indian farmer? Should you be taxing the agricultural income? Again, a political hot potato. No, a political hot potato. But I think it's an idea that found first mention in your survey, and then, of course, I think the Niti Aayog talks about it. Is this just perhaps very good economics, but will never be a reality? I mean, which politician in this country will stick out his neck, want to be elected, and say, I'm going to tax the farmers? Is there a way out?
Is that a question for me or for Vinayak? I think it's for you. You see, I think this is also, one of those issues where we need. See, remember again, remember the situation. The legal situation here is the following: nothing prevents state governments from taxing agricultural income. The constitutional restriction is on the central government taxing agricultural income. So there too, one could make the case that, this is a choice that's open to 29 state governments, and, if there are willing takers, all power to them.
Actually, the issue is not, the farming community is so disaggregated between the smallest, poorest, low acreage, less than 1 acre kind of farm to very rich landlords. I think the political discourse should change from not whether you should tax farmers, but whether you should tax rich farmers. And I do not think there's going to be great political opposition.
Do you believe in India we're going to see a beginning of a political discourse on this? I mean, very often, economic surveys or think tanks float ideas. Many people believe not doable, but then that's where the discussion begins on multi-brand retail, universal basic income. Just recent examples that I can quote. Do you believe this is the beginning of a public discourse?
See, I think that Vinayak has put his finger on the spot here. So for me, this is a profoundly, a deep and question to which I have no answer. Why is it, or I would turn around and just rephrase what Vinayak very nicely said. Why is it that it's very difficult to make the distinction between poor farmers and rich farmers? I think that's the question. Because why is it that when you say farmers, people think that you're going after the poor farmers? So what is it about our political discourse that does not allow these distinctions to be made? Why can't we say, rich, regardless of where they get their income, should be taxed? I mean, that's one way of thinking about this. And clearly, clearly we're not being able to do that. And so the deeper question is that what is it that will allow us to actually make that distinction? Because after all, you can be very socialist by making that distinction.
So thank you very much for being a very interactive audience. And thank you, gentlemen, for disagreeing on globalization and the future of this. Thank you very much.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/etnow.